This year, the Euro-African Forum will have two heads of state whose empathy is notorious. This is a fact that has driven the relations between Portugal and Angola. These relations were actually qualified as excellent during the CPLP, the Association of Portuguese-Speaking Countries Summit. Mr. President of Angola, João Lourenço, welcome. Mr. President of the Portuguese Republic, Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, welcome. The Portuguese president, you were the main driver behind this meeting. Thank you very much. If you allow me to say a few words, first of all, I'd like to greet you, Cristina. My main greeting goes to President João Lourenço. Today, he is the chairman of the CPLP and therefore our president, not just the president of Angola, the president of all the Portuguese-speaking citizens. It is a pleasure for me to have my president, João Lourenço, here with me. This forum is an initiative by the Diáspora Council that reports directly to the President of the Portuguese Republic. And year after year, we deal with matters that are important for the future partnership between Africa and Europe. President João Lourenço is also president of the CPLP. And at the historical summit in Luanda, he paved the ground with important ideas for the future. And I must say, we do have a prior matter that sometimes isn't understood in Europe, but it is fundamental. When we talk about social or economic development or the recovery of the economies, there is this prior issue. A huge part of the world is in pandemic, even in Europe. We are now transitioning from the pandemic situation to an endemic situation. This transition is quite advanced in Portugal because the fourth wave began earlier, at the end of 2020, start of 2021. But in many European countries, namely Eastern Europe, in many African countries, in many Asian countries, and in many American countries, namely in Latin America, the pandemic exists. And it restricts the economic recovery, the social recovery, and the capacity to face up to future years. It is highly unpredictable because we do not know the evolution of this pandemic. We believe that it will become endemic, but there's still quite a few uncertainty in the air. And President João Lourenço, I would like to ask you what the situation in Africa is like, namely in Angola. We've been facing a pandemic for a year and a half, and in the African country, it has already hit more than 8 million people. Thank you very much, Cristina. Thank you very much, President Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa. Thank you very much for having this initiative, for holding this meeting. Thank you very much for your kind words. The pandemic caught us all unawares. About a year and a half ago, it came about, and nobody imagined that it would be so contagious, that it would propagate the way it did, where it basically hit the whole of European space, the American continent, Asia, and, of course, the African continent, too. At that time, we expected that the outcome would be quite pessimistic for the African continent. Luckily, the reality we are living through today, although it is bad, it isn't as bad as we'd imagined. The economies were deeply hit, not just the African one, but in all the countries in the world, even the major powers. And we are currently fighting to overcome this wave and return as quickly as possible to a quasi-normality situation. That is what we hope above all. Mr. President, I would also ask you, President João Lourenço, in what stage of the pandemic do you feel you are in? Do you think it is somehow controlled? And in the country, do you still have the duty of curfew because you're in a state of calamity now that you're no longer in a state of emergency? No, there is no curfew. The only measures that we have is using a mask, especially in public places, sanitizing and washing your hands constantly, and having vaccines. We've had numerous stages already. We believe that we came out on the other side from them, and we are now at that stage where the victory will be reached if we are able to vaccinate as many citizens as we can. At this moment, we have about a third of the population vaccinated. Our population is just over 15 million inhabitants, the eligible population for vaccination, and about 5,540,226 citizens have now been vaccinated or have had at least the first shot of the vaccine. Of these, 1,330,301 have already taken 2 shots. So almost 5% of the population with full vaccination. Full vaccination. We are far from reaching our target. The immediate target is to have about 60% of the eligible population by December, and the rest of the way will be done perhaps in the first half year next year. Meanwhile, we will be talking to President Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa. European solidarity and even world solidarity, but considering that this is the Euro-African forum that focuses on the relations between Europe and Africa, I will ask you about access to vaccination and the solidarity exists, given that at the United Nations you spoke about the issue of the differences in accessing vaccines. Well, the European Union, as President João Lourenço recalled, straight after Asia, we were the second reality to be most hit. It was difficult at the start, last spring, but Europe quickly realized that this is a global phenomenon where we need international solidarity. Here is one of the examples of how multilateralism is fundamental. No power, no country, no matter how mighty they may be, can face this pandemic on their own. And in terms of sharing vaccines, 335 million vaccines are to be distributed, most of them through the COVAX mechanism, but also directly, and it falls under the member states to do so. Portugal, we had 1 million vaccines, and now our target is 3 million vaccines sent to our partners and CPLP countries. Bar a few exceptions, 2 or 3 exceptions, we have focused most of our energy in these partners. At European level, there has been asymmetry or inequality. There are countries that contribute more, others that contribute less, given their internal situation, of course, their domestic situation. This international effort from the community as a whole, when António Guterres asked for it, or at the European Union, is still insufficient. COVAX has done a lot in terms of targets, but we're still not there. In the African case, this is clear to see, but it's on a global scale, really. As for the European Union, the idea is to accelerate the process, and in the Portuguese case, continue to do so in the near future. We need to understand that the vaccine is the possible solution to control the pandemic and to have a swifter transition from pandemic to endemic state. There aren't any other solutions for now. This has been the solution, and in places where most people have been vaccinated, you can see this. It is not a magic wand that will fix the situation overnight, but it does help. So anything that has to do with asking the global community and the European Union to have more solidarity, to be quicker, to be more effective, is very important, because we all depend on all of us. The non-circulation of people, the limits on circulation, on mobility, the non-circulation of economic and social activities. I'm not even going to speak about mental health subjects. All of this leaves a wake that lasts for longer than we think. And that is a very important message now that we are in a forum where digitally we have entrepreneurs, people from the labor market, public policy makers, civil society agents. The major conclusion we can draw is that the lag in the recovery of the major economies, China, for instance, China isn't yet exporting the way it was. The United States of America, several countries with major economies in Europe also. What is happening in these countries and everywhere else in the world is that we felt that the pandemic is now overcome. Luckily, it didn't have the consequences that we feared, as João Lourenço said, but the effects of transitioning to a new normal is still seen. Yes, there have been a few difficulties, and the solidarity is indeed necessary. 23 million vaccines were sent to Africa, 10 times more than what had been delivered in June. This was in September, but it's still not enough. President João Lourenço, there is another aspect to do with vaccination that is relevant, which is logistics. It isn't easy to implement logistics and have so many people vaccinated. We noticed this throughout the world in few European countries, but here in Portugal too, we had those difficulties for a while. What we saw with the implementation in Portugal of a task force and the way in which this whole process took place, where 85% of the population is now vaccinated, do you feel that this is an example to take into account? Well, yes, of course. But I'd like to return to the issue of solidarity to tell you Angola and, in general, the African continent have benefited from the solidarity of the countries that have more capacity, especially to produce, to manufacture and procure vaccines, more so than through COVAX or bilaterally. We've been sent quite a few vaccines, and Angola is one of the countries that should acknowledge this gesture, and I'm here publicly acknowledging and thanking this gesture. The solidarity shown thus far has been limited only to donating vaccines, and we don't think that this is enough. What we feel is that another way of showing solidarity is to open to our countries the possibility of us, with our own resources, acquiring the vaccines we need. And that is the part that is lacking. We've been faced with huge difficulties in having access to the vaccine market. I wouldn't say that we should be helped in terms of having our capacity to produce our own vaccines, as this takes its time, and it won't be for this pandemic, maybe the next pandemic. But what we intend is for the possibility to be open to us, for us, at the same time as receiving vaccines freely, to buy vaccines with our own resources, the ones that should be available in the market with a reduction of costs. I'm asking you.
Bearing in mind the high costs that they still have. Yes, surely. If prices are lower, we would be very thankful for that. If we have lower prices, that is something that we will be deeply thankful for. In terms of logistics, well, we also have a task force. We don't call it like that. We call it a commission, multi-sectorial commission to fight COVID-19. But it is a task force, nevertheless, from the beginning. And coincidentally, at the same time as in Portugal, and we also have a general leading that task force as Portugal does. So he carries out functions in our executive body of the government. So it has been working quite well, this commission. We set up throughout all of the country a good capacity to test, but above all, a good capacity to preserve and freeze the vaccines. We have the capacity to preserve vaccines, be it in pure conservation, also in deep freeze, and also in ultra freeze in terms of Pfizer. So we can have about 17 million shots of vaccine stored, especially in Luanda, of course, but which we can easily take to the rest of the country. So in terms of logistics, we are okay, we are in a good place. Because the Commission is interministerial, there are several sectors that are involved, also the armed forces, that has the helicopters, and very quickly the vaccines are sent all over the country in a safe manner. Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, in terms of this solidarity, European solidarity, please elaborate a little bit more. Dear Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, we just heard the President João Lourenço asking for more access or lower price to acquire vaccines. So what is the role of the European Union, namely Portugal, because Portugal has special relations with Angola and other countries of CPLP. So in here we also are talking about private pharmaceutical labs. And so what can you tell us about the prices, the current prices? Well, I take this opportunity to not only to talk about that topic, which is fundamental, but about two others. I'm talking firstly about logistics. We cannot compare a country with the dimension of Portugal with a country with the dimension of Angola. So it is much, much easier to organize the logistics in Portugal than in such a big country as Angola is. In the case of Portugal, as you mentioned, Christina, at a given point in time, there was the main concern after the initial period when there were some problems with the supply. We are talking about January until March. Then, from there onwards, we are at cruise speed, and we will talk about that later on. And then we decided for something, a solution that is similar to Angola, which is, although everything is centered at the Ministry of Health, there is the permanent connection with other ministries. If we think about the important, very important role of the armed forces, with the different branches of the armed forces, and counting on a very important role of Vice Admiral Gouveia Melo, who came from the core of the armed forces. So we used all the advantage of the capacity of planning and assembling that the armed forces do have. Having in mind an exceptional collaboration with the different health professionals, namely coming from primary health care also, and that enabled us to move forward very, very quickly for many months. The second remark that I would like to make is on testing. João Lourenço said, and very well, at this stage that we are at, I could tell you that we have 93% of Portuguese people that have one vaccine of the two, and we have 76% with 2 doses, and now we are starting on the third shot for priority cases. And so we cannot stop testing extensively in schools for the economic activity, for some broader meetings, sometimes even family meetings, social professional meetings. We cannot make things easier. We need to test and test, of course not as intensively as we did in the past, but it is still very important so that we can monitor the evolution of the situation. Is it going well, not so well, besides the number of casualties and the number of infected people, and especially those committed to the hospital? Testing is extremely important, of paramount importance. But Portugal has, in a balanced manner, has been very sensitive to appeals of the European community and international community to the specific nature of such a vaccine as is something common, a common need to all of mankind. Of course, we are talking about private companies, private labs that produce the vaccines and then distribute the vaccines. Not all cases, because some of the vaccines came from public labs in different in other countries with public distribution. But now we need to debate internationally not only a treaty to prevent and to respond quickly in global terms to such pandemics as this one. And this is something that World Health Organization is also adopting, the European Union also agrees, but we should think whether there are no vaccines that in some conditions have an importance that is common to all of mankind, which forces us to restrict the gains of these companies and to restrict costs and price. And we know that this should be done. We know that the necessary investments for this type of research are very, very high, and we achieved what nobody thought it was possible. After 1 year we had a vaccine. We were talking about 6 years, then 4, then 1. So we cannot be demagogic here, but we also need a balance. when the private sector needs to bear in mind the conditions of production and distribution, because the importance for mankind is such that it is impossible not to look at these vaccines that have such a broad spectrum without a specific statute. Of course, in the beginning, nobody was ready. There were no laws to oversee this, but we should be thinking about this in the future. We should act before things happen. We will be accompanying the evolution of this pandemic, of course, but life itself, life of all of mankind, is a society, economy, whatever, depends on this, even in societies that were hit less hard. But for all of us, it's important. We are all hit by this. So we are following this situation. Dear President Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, you were recently with the regional director of the World Health Organization for Europe, and that was one of the topics that you talked about, namely the lessons that we can draw from this pandemic and how to look at the future, namely with a possible international treaty that is able to care for given situations in order to respond in a more efficient manner. Yes. Yesterday I read a report on the pandemic, so there is already a report, a commission of representatives of numerous countries. Only China is not represented now, but maybe they will be, and the Russian Federation, but Europe, America, Africa and Asia are represented. And one of these, we have many conclusions, but one of those conclusions is what we call in international slang a non-paper, so an informal document that will be studied by World Health Organization and the United Nations in order to be the first step towards a treaty on a new topic, which, for instance, in Europe forced us to create an authority for health. We did not have that in Europe, so it was something that just belonged to the individual states. So maybe in the African continent they don't have that, in Latin America they don't have that, in South America that does not exist. There is not an international body which deals permanently with this reality, health. And Europe felt that was necessary because health is a basic issue. So health suddenly was paralyzed and everything was paralyzed. So then maybe it's worthwhile to think about bodies that look at health besides the World Health Organization, of course. Yes, dear President João Lourenço, do you agree with the possibility of creating a sort of an international treaty that deals with this situation? And I also ask you, in Angola, this topic of health became priority, and the pandemic brought to the fore some frailties in all health systems in all of the world. And so you also promoted the construction of hospitals, yes? Well, I would start by corroborating what the President Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa just said, because we live in a global world. The pandemic is global, so it reached the global scale, and so the solution for this pandemic and for others that are similar to this one, the solution must also be global. World economy is not going to recuperate from this so quickly, and there are some countries in the world that may not be able to overcome the problems that this pandemic brought about. So we need to look at a global solution We need to exit this public health crisis in a positive manner, because otherwise the recovery of world economy is going to be very difficult. Health was the most visible part of this pandemic. When we talk about the pandemic, we look immediately at health, but I need to tell you that the economy also in the social part of the society also was, these two members of the equation were severely hit. In a short period of time, we made a lot of investments. We built new hospitals that we called previously or temporary hospitals, just to deal with the COVID-19. And we will go on, we will invest further, because the other diseases are still out there. Besides COVID-19, we have tuberculosis, malaria, we have a lot of other diseases that are still existing. So we need to look at everything. We need to look at the other diseases globally, because they also impact our populations. And now, once again, in terms of vaccination, from November onwards, it will be obligatory to show digital certificates, to have access to schools, to sports venues. So I ask you, because I think there is a race to those certificates and therefore to the vaccine. So I ask you, what's the status quo in terms of supply and demand? What do you think? Well, demand has been very, very high, so there are big queues in the vaccination centers. The competent authorities have opened almost new centers for vaccination on a daily basis. We have enough vaccines for everybody, but we need to accelerate, and we need to have more and more vaccination centers. And above all, we need to recruit more people, more staff for the vaccination, because with vaccines we need somebody, we need the technical staff to ensure that this is given to the population. The pandemic is dragging on more than 1 year and a half ago. That's when it started. Our health professionals are very, very tired. They work on a daily basis with very intensive schedule, so we are recruiting more people in order to conclude this vaccination process quickly. So, dear Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, I'm talking about the economic matter, the economic side of things, because the impact that COVID had on the economy and the finances of all of the world. What type of European solidarity can exist at this level with Africa, namely with Angola? And what can the role of Portugal be, bearing in mind the special relations that exist between the two presidents and the two countries?
First of all, I'd like to make 3 remarks very briefly. The European Union, during the Portuguese presidency of the European Council, moved forward with the digital COVID certificate that President João Lourenço spoke about. It's fundamental. The second is to tell you that in Europe also, especially in Portugal, the idea of recovering what was left behind in terms of health, investment in health, and above all, investment in human resources in health was already a need. It was a need before the pandemic that was only heightened by the pandemic. As for the economy, in general, I would say that what we are experiencing in the world today, and we will speak about Portugal and Angola, is that this getting started is slower. There's a mismatch between supply and demand, which has led to rising prices for some products. More demand, less supply. There are other problems that we've seen with regard to the rising costs of energy, because during the pandemic there wasn't any investment in renewables or classic energy generation sources. So this lag obviously has huge costs at the moment, momentary costs, more so in some countries than others. As for Portugal and Angola, recently there was a summit at the level of the ministries between Portugal and Angola. As we said after the Luanda summit, it ended in an exceptional relations in terms of exceptional climate of our relations at all levels. Investment, collaboration for planning investment in a stage that is crucial, which is post-pandemic, but also in the field of overcoming the problems that will arise in the future, circulation of people and mobility, circulation between the countries, the capacity to look at new ways of funding economic development, financing economic development. That is a concern that President João Lourenço has, even at the CPLP. So this summit that came before other summits we will have with other brother countries, so the summit with Angola in November was before the one with Mozambique, and there will be others with members of the CPLP. And it showed the good times we are experiencing. We know the pandemic has costs. We know that these economic costs last longer than we expect. Recovery isn't overnight. But the fact that we agree as to the fields in which you're able to cooperate, the shift in cooperation instruments, we need to move forward with them very quickly, and this is fundamental. And it has to do with another idea that Portugal has had within the European Union, the partnership between Europe and Africa. Angola, in addition to being in the CPLP, is an African power that goes way beyond Africa. It is a privileged partner within this partnership. Europe isn't always very sensitive to these issues, Northern Europe, but now they understand that there is an affinity, a socio-economic affinity with Africa that is greater than the ones we have with other continents. That is also strong. And that is one of the lessons learned from the pandemic. To recover and to take a qualitative leap in the energy transition, in the digital transition, in the ways of financing the economic future in the short term, in new ways of investing. And here, the entrepreneurs and civil society's imagination is crucial. We cannot waste any time. Today, we are still discussing this reality because it's here. But if everything goes well, in a year's time, or less than a year's time, we will be increasingly discussing post-pandemic. That is the huge challenge for anyone taking part in this forum today. Please don't forget that we need to overcome the pandemic well. We cannot have any relapses because they would be fatal. But we need to think, as we are already thinking about between Portugal and Angola, about the following day. So a true partnership between siblings, but seeing that Portugal is also a gateway, President João Lourenço, for this relevance that the African continent is taking on in Europe, Europe needs Africa and Africa needs Europe. Mr. President, I would, notwithstanding what I just said, I would also raise another issue here that has to do with the economic and financial reality because of the pandemic. The economic contraction was notorious in all the countries, namely in Angola, it was about 5.4% last year. But the World Bank envisages a recovery of 0.4 for this year, as opposed to the IMF. Is it possible to anticipate a growth in African countries, although at different speeds? And here there is a pressure, or could there be a different pressure on Angola because of the oil prices? First of all, I'd like to talk about the relations between Angola and Portugal, following what President Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa has just said. I was fortunate, and I am fortunate, that during my first term in office, we have known how to maintain our ties of friendship and cooperation between Portugal and Angola quite high. This has been on all levels, including on a personal level. Notwithstanding the fact that, in the case of Portugal, the head of state comes from one political party and the Prime Minister comes from another political party, but even so, I believe that this didn't hinder in any way the good relations that Portugal has maintained with Portugal and Portugal with Angola. Interpersonal relations also help, of course. We were able to build these relations over the years with President Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa and with the Prime Minister, António Costa. I must say that in May of this year, we announced that we would begin to exhume the deadly remains of the victims of the 27th of May, and 2-3 days later, the Prime Minister of Portugal called me and said that he would offer the experts that Portugal has in this field, and I obviously accepted it. So this is just a small anecdote to show you of how far our relations are. As for the economy, yes, in 2017 our economy wasn't doing well already. Our debt level was quite high, and it would worsen. And then, as if that weren't enough, we were hit by a pandemic. It obviously hit everyone. But I must say, notwithstanding the pandemic, Angola is actually doing quite well. We have an agreement with the IMF that will end in December this year. We are pleased with the outcome of this agreement, and we believe that the IMF is also pleased with the results. And the trend is for our economy to begin to grow as of next year. It will grow faster the sooner we are able to exit this pandemic. Thank you very much. Mr. President, I will set you a challenge at the end of this conversation. These 50 minutes went by way too fast. But in 2 minutes' time, you each have 2 minutes to leave us a final message, please. I will leave a message that is in line with what President João Lourenço has just said. There are excellent relations between our states. They improved over the last few years, but they were already in line with what the relations between the states should be when they have excellent relations between peoples, because excellent relations between peoples will determine that they are so at the level of the states also. But I must add that the personal relations were outstanding at all levels. The Prime Minister of Portugal, me, we have exceptional relations with President João Lourenço, and it's because of him we contributed, but it's his merit, really, because President João Lourenço, of your capacity to understand, your empathy, and at the moment we have the same understanding as to the urgency in overcoming this pandemic. And we have the same understanding as to the urgency in our economic and social recovery. Angola wants to do so quickly. Portugal, too, hopes that we will grow this year, turning a new leaf. And in the coming years, which are a unique opportunity for quantitative and qualitative leaps. If we are able to have these qualitative leaps together, this is amazing. Just like if we see the same leading role in Angola, in the African continent, and in Portugal, this connection we have with European countries, from our neighboring Spain to all other European countries, a lot of them have good relations with Angola too. So we have this puzzle where we are one, where Portugal and Angola are a strong axis, even within the CPLP, heightened within the CPLP, but outside of it also. And this axis has other ones. And everything is helped by the personal relations and, above all, by that which brings our peoples together. They get along very well. Portuguese that live in Angola and the Angolan who live in Portugal, they all get together. Yes, of course. And President João Lourenço, a final message, please. I would like to say that our countries, Angola and Portugal, are doomed to live together, hugging each other, embracing each other. Nothing can waver the relations that will always be good between our two countries. Portugal can count on Angola in all situations, the same way that Angola counts on Portugal at all times and in all situations. So, once again, President Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you personally. Thank you very much, Mr. President João Lourenço and Mr. President Rebelo de Sousa. Thank you very much for taking part in this chat between presidents.